Hello, I'm Jeremy Fernandez. Tonight on The Virus, your freedom of movement on the line, how the COVID-19 crisis is reshaping travel and reigniting cross-border tensions. Plus, the battle lines are drawn over an international investigation. So how much will we learn about the origins of this outbreak? But first, a period of national solidarity. Some leaders are now turning on each other. New South Wales is lifting more restrictions on work and play and now wants interstate borders to come down too. That's drawn a heated response from the leaders of WA, Queensland and the Northern Territory, who say reopening the borders would be irresponsible. The New South Wales Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, does appear to have national medical officials on her side. And she's hitting back at her critics, saying they're keeping the borders closed to bolster their own popularity at home. There's been a strong push from federal politicians to get the economy back in action because of the success Australia's had in managing the crisis.
From a medical point of view, I can't see why the borders are still closed, but as I said, that's for the states and territories.
I think expressing an opinion about the future economic health of our nation is what I should be allowed to do.
We're not going to be lectured to by a state that has the highest number of cases in Australia.
I mean, New South Wales had the Ruby Princess. I mean, seriously? And they're trying to give us advice on our borders?
Well, the fight is being fuelled by Qantas, which wants to get its planes back in the air. It wants half of its fleet servicing the main domestic routes by July, using every seat on board. Health experts say that would compromise the protective barrier provided by physical distancing. The Qantas boss, Alan Joyce, says restrictions on passenger numbers are just not economically possible and promises that extra health precautions will be put in place.
Social distancing on an aircraft isn't practical. To give you some of the numbers, I mean, IATA have come out and said if we take the middle seat now, airfares will probably go up by around 50%. They're not recommending it, the European Union isn't. But even the middle seat only gives you 60 centimetres gap. We're providing masks and sanitising wipes and hand sanitisers to all customers. And we will be limiting movement in flight. Masks will not be mandatory from a safety point of view, but they will be recommended to be worn in the interests of everybody's peace of mind.
So if Qantas doesn't get its way, here's what you're in for. The airline's workhorse on domestic routes is the Boeing 737. There are 162 in economy and 12 seats in business class. If social distancing were to be observed on board with 4 square metres per passenger, the plane would be limited to carrying just 21 passengers, putting prices up significantly. There's also a lot of consternation over commuter routes as we return to work. For example, the New South Wales government is aiming for 12 people on each bus that would usually seat 60 people. 320 is the target for a train and 245 on a ferry. It also wants the daily number of trips capped at 600,000, which is a fraction of the 2.3 million daily services before COVID-19. And that's the dilemma facing public transport operators everywhere who'll struggle to fund their services while keeping the required health measures in place.
It will be far worse than it had been prior to COVID-19, but it won't be as bad if, in fact, we get staggered working hours.
We've got to find ways to manage the people that need to get to work and are essential and cannot get to work on public transport.
And you can see here how much our movements changed when isolation orders were put in place. This is a snapshot of retail and recreation. On average, the baseline, or the 0% figure you can see on the left, was established in January and early February. The upswing in activity in the past few weeks coincides with states lifting isolation measures. And this is how transport usage changed in that time. The data released by Apple measures requests for driving directions entered into Apple's mapping services. Those fell by an average of 73% across the 3 categories and reached their lowest level on the 11th of April. Public transport, the dark blue line here, was down 83% at that time. Well, public transport, domestic air travel and border closures are vital to Australia's economic fight back from the coronavirus, and there have been plenty of questions from you about them. To provide some answers, we pulled in the economist Tim Harcourt and transport expert Matthew Hounsell. This question came in via the ABC News website. I'm worried about gridlock when we all head back to our workplaces. Should I be worried about gridlock?
Yes. The transport system is people using the road network, so we can adapt. But if we don't institute some measures and if we don't change our behaviours, then we risk exceeding the capacity of the system to move the amount of cars that are seeking to use it. So we've got to adapt our behaviours to minimise the amount of people trying to travel at the same time. Essentially, we have to flatten the peak transport curve.
So what do you mean by measures? I mean, we've heard the Deputy Chief Medical Officers talk about this flattening of the curve, the burden on the public transport systems. We've heard premiers talking about this. What does that mean in practical terms?
None of the problems we're facing now are actually new problems. They're the same problem, just amplified many times more by the fact that the public transport isn't carrying as many people. So we always had the problem of everyone turning up at work at 9 o'clock, our high schools starting about 9 o'clock, and everyone trying to leave work at 5 p.m. So at 5:07 p.m. was the absolute start of the peak when the massive surge of people hit Town Hall Station. And that's what puts the transport system under stress. So if we can change our hours of operation to spread out the peak, what is called time shifting, then we can actually have a more functional system all of the year.
So, Tim, that seems to shift some of the responsibility onto employers, doesn't it? Because it's up to them then to absorb how the workforce is structured, how many people can work from home, whether people arriving at the office is staggered through the day, and that differs from city to city, town to town.
Exactly, Jeremy. And what's interesting about this whole COVID period, the coronanomics of it, is that we've noticed now you can see blue skies, people in South Asia can see the Himalayas all of a sudden. You've had a huge reduction in carbon emissions. We've seen what would happen, if we got on top of the climate change issue. We've seen what would happen when we get on top of congestion. So in some way it's been a nice test case of what could happen if we brought in measures to combat climate change. And the second part of your question really is, to what extent can we change the workforce to meet these new needs? So part of it is working from home. Can employers provide that flexibility? But where does the responsibility hold in law for occupational health and safety? If you fall off your ladder, putting up a book at home or something, is your employer liable?
Which is a fair question, and also, providing the infrastructure that you need at home, whether it's a standing desk or a laptop or the sort of software that you might need to operate at home.
Yeah, look, I think for academics and journalists and researchers, I think they've been able to, manage quite well working at home. But obviously, there's some frontline essential services, not that journalists are non-essential, who obviously need to be at work. And I think, as Matt says, we're going to start looking at staggering of commuting times and using private and public transport in that manner.
We had this question about buses in particular, where in some parts of the country there's a limit of 12 people per bus. There's varying reports about how much that is being enforced. And so about this question of enforcement of those limits, how far can that possibly go?
Let's remember that we're adults and we have a responsibility to ourselves and to our community to do the right thing. It shouldn't be up to the bus drivers to police it, and we should also be willing to accept some social sanction for people to tell us not to crowd onto a bus when it's already full.
Tim, do you have a sense of economically what sort of cost burden that puts on the operators of these services?
Oh, well, quite clearly they've had to absorb a lot of costs because of the crisis. Fortunately, they've been temporary, and fortunately, in some ways, the whole COVID period has allowed us to buy some time and experiment with innovations that might actually help us. What we've noticed during coronavirus is that in manufacturing, companies like Gecko Systems in Ballarat that do mineral processing, they're now making ventilators. Detmold manufacturing in Adelaide. All the gin makers and craft brewers in Botany are now making hand sanitisers. So it sort of shows you that manufacturing, transport, a lot of our companies have been able to be quite nimble and move towards a transition state.
I just want to echo what Tim said, but what we refer to it in transport is tactical urbanism, where cities like Paris, London, Toronto, New York, they are implementing bike lanes, moving parking, changing the operation of their city, using bollards and those Jersey barriers. They don't necessarily have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing really expensive infrastructure when you can trial it and implement things in an efficient, basically tested and see approach. We don't necessarily have to go into the big investments to make big wins.
A number of questions we've had relate to school services and getting kids to school on time. Obviously, it's a different proposition when you're talking about workplaces being able to stagger start times for workers. That doesn't work so well in a school environment. How do you see us getting around that logistical problem?
We also need to have each school looking at what's best for them. We need to look at making sure that before and after school care is more practical and more affordable at each of the schools so that we can adapt into the long term for these issues. As for getting to school, we need to make sure that the most students who are able to use active transport use active transport. And that means making our roads safe so that the mothers I see on the bicycle aren't terrified their children are going to be run over.
Matthew, tell me about what your view is about the state of airline travel domestically in Australia right now. We had a question about whether we'll see more or fewer airlines after this crisis is over, and will prices become stubbornly high?
I expect that there will be 2 airlines because Australia is a natural duopoly nation. We seem to always form duopolies, but I suspect the government will have to do some intervention to ensure that Virgin survives or another airline comes in to take its place. We do have the problem that a lot of our air traffic, we have some of the busiest air traffic corridors in the world between Sydney and Melbourne. I think it's number 3. But we also have air corridors that would be better served by high-speed rail. There is a train or a bus or a plane to Canberra every hour, and that's more than enough demand to be served by high-speed rail and to allow places like Campbelltown and Goulburn to be more connected into a regional transport network. So maybe we start to look at this and ask ourselves some questions about how we travel, why we travel, and is there a better way to move people around the country.
Matthew Madeleine, who's joining us on Facebook, asked this question about whether high-capacity transport infrastructure such as cross-city motorways that we see in our largest cities would become not worth the investment if these changes that you're speaking about would be made.
They're not very efficient. It costs $500 million per kilometre to dig the WestConnex and $200 million per kilometre to dig a railway tunnel. And the railways can carry about 10 times the amount of people. We need to ask the question, are we running our nation efficiently, or are we just burning our money because people, and primarily the politicians, like cars?
Matthew Hounsell there with Tim, the airport economist. The government's admitted that its scheme to protect jobs during the pandemic is being paid to around half the number of workers it claimed, and the JobKeeper package is set to cost about $70 billion, not the $130 billion that was forecast.
Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures.
No one was ever in doubt about its scale.
We are committing $130 billion.
The numbers seemed astonishing from the very beginning.
Almost 6 million Australians.
If anything, the sheer magnitude of the JobKeeper scheme was lost in the repetition.
We've got 6.1 million Australians and more who will be benefiting from the JobKeeper program.
The number of employees now exceeds 6 million.
The maths had all been done by Treasury.
There's around or a bit over 6 million employees would be covered.
But sometime after the Treasury Secretary and his team fronted the Parliament, a few billion pennies began to drop. in what it and the tax office call a reporting error. Just under 1 million businesses had enrolled for JobKeeper. All was OK there, but they've declared the number of workers actually receiving the payments not going to be around 6.5 million, rather 3.5. And the cost? Not $130 billion, but around $70 billion, a full $60 billion out.
This is good news for the taxpayer. No underpayments were made, no overpayments were made.
This is a mistake you could have seen from space. And this is a government that couldn't run a bath.
$60 billion in 6 weeks on a single program is a record-breaking mistake, raising questions about who's to blame.
How about someone in this government accept responsibility just once?
The problem came when many businesses applying for the payment wrongly entered the dollars they expected their staff to receive, not the number of workers on their books.
So the question was clearly reasonably clear. It is just unfortunate that 1,000 employers misunderstood it.
This error is monumental and alarming that it wasn't found sooner. And while the government argues it's only a forecasting or tracking mistake, it's not without political consequences either, because the question's already being asked: if you've underspent to here, why not extend the length or coverage of the scheme for those who need it?
This is all borrowed money, but it's not an invitation to go and spend more money.
That's an argument still to be reconciled, just like the costings.
Well, pubs, cafes and restaurants in New South Wales will be able to seat up to 50 patrons at a time from the 1st of June. The government there says distancing guidelines will still need to be followed. The 4 square metre spacing requirement means the size of each venue will determine customer numbers. In South Australia, pubs can now seat 20 patrons, 10 indoors and 10 outside.
Thank you.
Australian health officials say the bans will continue to be lifted because the nation's case rate remains low. This week, only around 10 new cases have been confirmed each day nationally. The Northern Territory and the ACT have been totally cleared of active cases, as has South Australia, which has recorded only 1 new case in the past month. Globally, however, it's a different story. The number of known infections is now above 5 million. And this week, more than 100,000 new cases were reported worldwide in just one 24-hour period, the most in one day since the outbreak began. Just 4 countries account for around 2/3 of those new cases: the US, Russia, Brazil and the UK. The World Health Assembly has this week approved a major international investigation into the COVID-19 crisis. And even though it's supported by China, it's still unclear how much it will cooperate. Australia was one of the first countries to call for such a probe, sparking a diplomatic row with our biggest trading partner. And following the approval, China's frustration showed when it called Australia a dog of the United States.
The resolution is therefore adopted.
And with that, 137 nations agreed to an inquiry into the coronavirus crisis. A moment of global unity? Not quite.
We advise Australia to read the original text carefully.
Over in Beijing, the Chinese Foreign Ministry was very keen to lecture Australia, urging it to
change its course, completely abandon political manipulation.
China's still bristling over Australia's early calls for an independent probe. Its state media lampooning Australia as this giant kangaroo that serves as a dog of the United States. While in Canberra,
fake news.
Its ambassador has threatened trade boycotts and described the Morrison government's claims of vindication a joke.
The sheer offensiveness of Chinese diplomacy right now is making it easy for Australia to push back.
Australia's not alone in feeling the heat from Xi Jinping's emissaries. France, Germany and Canada, among others, to experience what's called wolf warrior diplomacy.
Wolf warrior.
An aggressive approach that repurposes the muscular, nationalistic sentiment of a Chinese movie franchise. Jamming Australia between an authoritarian President Xi and
putting America first.
Well, thanks for joining us on the program. If you want to see more from that Q&A session with the economist Tim Harcourt and transport expert Matthew Hounsell, just go to the ABC News YouTube and Facebook channels. The full chat is right there. For now, though, thanks for your company. Stay safe. Goodbye.